Alvera Holloway was the perfect mother until the day her children vanished without a trace. Nerian, Vexley, and Liora Holloway had once been seen playing in their overgrown yard, their laughter carried by the wind. Then, one day, the laughter stopped. The Holloway house stood silent, its windows dark, its doors locked. Days turned into weeks, and no one saw the children again. But when detectives finally stepped inside that house, they uncovered a nightmare so twisted, so horrifying, that even the most hardened investigators would never forget the secrets hidden within. Red Hollow was the kind of town where nothing truly bad ever happened. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, it was a place where neighbors knew one another, where front doors remained unlocked, and where crime was a rarity. That was why the disappearance of the Holloway children sent shockwaves through the community. Alvera Holloway had lived in town for nearly a decade. A single mother of 3, she was known for being quiet but polite. She rarely attended neighborhood gatherings and kept to herself, but no one had ever suspected anything sinister about her. She was seen as a devoted mother, though a little odd. Someone who always seemed distant, lost in her own world. It was the school that first noticed something was wrong. Nerian, Vexley, and Liora had always been quiet children, but they were regular in their attendance. Their sudden, unexplained absence raised concerns. At first, teachers assumed they might be sick, but days turned into weeks, and still they did not return. Repeated calls to Alvera went unanswered. Finally, Mrs. Langford, Leora's homeroom teacher, reported the situation to the authorities. 2 officers were sent to the Holloway house for a routine welfare check. The house itself sat at the edge of town, an aging Victorian structure surrounded by overgrown grass and skeletal trees. It had always looked a little neglected, but that day something about it felt different. Too quiet, too still. Alvera answered the door, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide and unblinking, darted nervously between the officers. When asked about the children, she smiled in a way that did little to hide her discomfort. She claimed they were staying with their father for a while. That was when the first red flag appeared. The officers knew from town records that the children's father, Tobias Holloway, had died in a car accident nearly 5 years ago. There was no other family they could have gone to, at least none that anyone knew of. When they pressed Alvera for more details, she hesitated, then quickly said she had meant their uncle. Something about the way she spoke set the officers on edge. Her voice was too rehearsed, her manner too rigid. One of them, Officer Grady, asked if they could step inside to look around. Alvera's expression shifted almost instantly. The smile vanished, replaced by something colder. She refused, claiming the house was in disarray and that she wasn't feeling well. Without cause for immediate danger, the officers had no right to force their way in, but their instincts told them something was wrong. They filed a report and urged Child Protective Services to investigate. Over the next few days, neighbors were questioned. Many admitted they hadn't seen the Holloway children in weeks. One elderly woman, Mrs. Coulter, who lived directly across the street, recalled something unsettling. She often sat by her front window in the evenings, and a few nights prior she had seen Alvera carrying large black garbage bags out to her backyard. She had assumed it was just trash, but now, with everything happening, she wasn't so sure. Another neighbor, Marlowe Driscoll, mentioned something even more disturbing. He had woken up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint cries. At first he thought it was an animal, maybe a wounded deer in the woods, but as he listened closer, he realized it sounded like a child. The cries had lasted for only a few minutes before abruptly stopping. With each account, the sense of urgency grew. Detectives were assigned to the case and a formal search warrant was obtained. When law enforcement returned to the Holloway residence, this time with the legal authority to enter, they had no idea they were about to uncover a nightmare beyond their darkest imaginations. The Holloway house was silent when detectives arrived with their search warrant. A few uniformed officers stood at the front steps, their expressions tense as they prepared for what lay ahead. The old Victorian structure, with its weathered paint and broken shutters, seemed to loom over them, casting long shadows in the fading afternoon light. The air was thick with an uneasy stillness. When Alvera Holloway opened the door, she didn't seem surprised to see them. If anything, she looked resigned, as if she had been expecting this moment. She didn't protest when they showed her the warrant, nor did she ask any questions. Instead, she simply stepped aside, allowing them inside without a word. The interior of the house was nothing like the outside world had imagined. Those who had assumed the Holloway children lived in a warm, cozy home were met with a disturbing reality. The air inside was heavy with the scent of bleach, yet beneath it lingered something foul, something that sent an immediate sense of dread through the officers. The living room was unnaturally clean, too clean. The floors gleamed as if they had been scrubbed over and over. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of any disorder, but something about the stillness felt staged. It was as if someone had wiped away the existence of children from the space, yet their presence remained in subtle, haunting ways. A pair of small shoes neatly placed by the door, a single crayon wedged in the floorboards. A child's drawing, half erased, peeking from beneath a chair. Upstairs, the children's bedrooms told a different story. Their beds were untouched, the blankets stiff with dust. It was clear no one had slept in them for quite some time. In Liora's room, stuffed animals were carefully arranged on a shelf, their glassy eyes staring out blankly. But what unsettled detectives the most were the closets. They were completely empty. No clothing, no personal belongings, nothing. It was as if someone had deliberately erased the children's presence from the house. The deeper they searched, the more disturbing things became. The basement door was locked, a rusted chain wrapped tightly around the handle. It took a crowbar to force it open. The first thing they noticed was the smell. Thick, putrid, and undeniable. Inside the basement, the walls were covered in eerie drawings. Jagged shapes, chaotic scribbles, and crude stick figures filled the space. Many of the drawings depicted a tall, faceless figure standing over three smaller figures. Others showed what appeared to be children trapped inside small, dark spaces. Some were smeared with what looked like dried blood. A notebook was found among the clutter. Inside, the pages were filled with erratic, nearly illegible handwriting. Phrases like, "Purify the soul," and "They must be cleansed," were repeated over and over. Some pages had frantic sketches of eyes, scratched into the paper as if the writer had been consumed by paranoia. But nothing compared to what was hidden beneath the floorboards. When officers noticed a section of loose wood near the back of the basement, they pried it open, revealing a horrifying secret: a pile of children's clothing, stained with something dark and unmistakable. Some of the garments matched what Nerian and Vexley had last been seen wearing. The house, once a quiet and unassuming home, had become something else entirely, a crime scene filled with secrets, each one more horrifying than the last. Detectives knew they were no longer looking for missing children. They were searching for something much worse. The backyard of the Holloway house stretched into an overgrown field, tangled with weeds and wild grass that had not been tended to in years. A few broken garden ornaments stood among the thorns, their chipped surfaces coated in dirt. The most unsettling part of the yard, however, was the old stone well near the tree line. It was covered in moss, its edges crumbling with age, a relic from a time when the house had been part of a working farm. The well had long been considered nothing more than a forgotten structure, a useless fixture that blended into the landscape. But now it was the center of the investigation. Detectives had already found blood-stained clothing beneath the basement floorboards, and the neighbors' reports of strange noises and Alvera's odd behavior had pushed them to investigate every inch of the property. A forensic team gathered around the well, their expressions grim as they prepared to lower a camera into the darkness below. The first officer to peer over the edge recoiled almost immediately, his face turning pale. Something was in the water. The camera was carefully lowered, its light cutting through the shadows. As the image came into focus on the screen, what they saw sent a chill through the entire team. A small, decomposing hand jutted out of the murky water, its fingers stiff and motionless. More shapes emerged as the camera moved deeper, revealing what everyone had feared: bodies. The remains were retrieved with care, the weight of the discovery heavy on those watching. 2 small corpses, barely recognizable, were pulled from the well. The medical examiner on the scene took a breath before confirming what the detectives had suspected. The bodies belonged to Nerian and Vexley. The town of Red Hollow would never be the same. The realization that Alvera had not only lied about the whereabouts of her children, but had hidden their lifeless bodies just steps from her own home left the community in shock. But there was one pressing question that could not be ignored. Where was Liora? If Alvera had murdered her sons, had she done the same to her daughter? And if so, where was her body? The well had held 2 victims, but the absence of the third left investigators restless. A search of the surrounding property yielded no additional remains, no fresh graves, no signs of a hurried burial. Yet something felt off. It was Marlowe Driscoll, the neighbor who had reported the eerie nighttime cries, who provided detectives with a lead they had overlooked. While discussing the case, he mentioned an odd detail that hadn't seemed important at the time. On multiple occasions, he had seen a dim light flickering in the attic of the Holloway house late at night. It was faint, almost like the glow of a single candle, and it had always vanished quickly. With this new information, authorities turned their attention to the attic. The house had already revealed horrifying secrets in the basement, but no one had yet explored the highest level. They moved swiftly, climbing the creaking wooden stairs until they reached a narrow door at the top. The handle was rusted, the frame warped, but with enough force they pushed it open. The attic was small, the ceiling slanted, the air thick with dust and decay. An old wooden crib sat in the corner, its frame worn and cracked. Inside, the mattress was torn apart, deep claw marks cutting through the fabric, as if something had desperately tried to escape. And then one of the officers noticed it, a trap door, barely visible beneath a tattered rug. When they pried it open, what they found inside would haunt them forever. The hidden trap door revealed a narrow crawl space, no larger than a closet. The air inside was thick with a sickly odor, a mix of mold, sweat, and something far worse. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt suffocating, as if it had absorbed every bit of light for years. The officers aimed their flashlights inside, their beams cutting through the dust, swirling in the air, and then they saw her. Liora Holloway lay curled in the corner, her frail body pressed against the wooden walls. She was barely recognizable, her skin pale and stretched thin over her bones. Her hair was tangled, matted with dirt, and her eyes, hollow and unfocused, did not react to the sudden light. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stared, as if she had long since lost the ability to understand what was happening around her. The officers moved quickly, pulling her out of the crawl space and into the attic. Her body was so light it felt weightless in their arms. Her lips were cracked, her hands trembling as they gripped the fabric of the officer's sleeve. She was alive, but just barely. Paramedics were called immediately and Liora was rushed to the hospital. The medical staff who examined her later said it was a miracle she had survived. Her body was severely malnourished, her muscles weak from years of neglect. But what horrified them the most were the scars. Some were old, faded into thin white lines, while others were fresh, dark, and angry against her skin. It was clear she had endured unimaginable suffering. Meanwhile, detectives continued to search the attic, hoping to uncover more answers about what had happened in that house. Scattered across the floor were more pages of Alvera's disturbing writings. The entry spoke of purification, of cleansing the darkness within the children. Some passages were incomprehensible, spiraling into nonsense, but others painted a clear picture of a woman consumed by delusion. She believed her children had been tainted by unseen forces, that their souls needed to be stripped of impurities. The most chilling discovery was a wooden box tucked beneath the crib. Inside were small objects, locks of hair, tiny teeth, and what appeared to be fingernails. Labeled scraps of paper bore the names of her children, as if each item had been taken as part of some ritualistic act. With Liora safe and the bodies of Nerian and Vexley recovered, authorities finally confronted Alvera Holloway. They had expected her to break down, to show remorse or fear. Instead, she sat calmly in the interrogation room, her hands folded neatly on the table. When asked why she had killed her sons and imprisoned her daughter, she only smiled. "They were never meant to leave," she whispered. Alvera refused to say anything more, offering no explanation, no details of her twisted beliefs. She did not ask about Liora, did not acknowledge what she had done. Her expression never changed, her vacant eyes never flickering with emotion. It was as if she had already left reality behind, retreating into whatever world she had built in her mind. When the trial began, forensic psychiatrists examined her and concluded she suffered from severe delusional disorder and psychopathy. She had truly believed that what she was doing was necessary, that she was saving her children from something only she could see. The jury had no sympathy. The evidence was overwhelming. The horrors she had inflicted upon her own children were too great to ignore. When the verdict was read, life in prison without parole, Alvera did not react. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Liora, the sole survivor, was placed under the care of specialists who worked to help her recover. But some wounds do not heal easily. She spoke very little of what had happened to her. Some nights nurses found her sitting awake, staring at the corner of the room, as if afraid something still lingered in the darkness. The Holloway house was abandoned after Alvera's arrest. Over time, nature began to reclaim it, vines curling around its rotting frame, the paint peeling away with each passing season. Yet those who passed by at night swore they could still hear something from within. The faint sound of a child's whisper, trapped within the walls of a house that had long since become a tomb. The trial of Alvera Holloway became one of the most shocking cases in the town's history. Reporters from across the country flooded Red Hollow, eager to cover the horrifying details of what became known as the Monster Mom case. People who had once lived side by side with Alvera struggled to comprehend how a woman they had known for years could be capable of such evil. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The prosecution laid out the disturbing reality of what had happened inside the Holloway home. Forensic evidence confirmed that Nerian and Vexley had died from a combination of starvation and blunt force trauma. The bruises and fractures on their bodies suggested they had been abused long before their deaths. The well behind the house, where their remains had been discarded, had served as a silent grave for months before their discovery. Liora's testimony was the most chilling. Though she was barely able to speak about what had been done to her, the little she revealed was enough to send shivers through everyone in the courtroom. She described the darkness of the crawlspace, the hunger that gnawed at her daily, and the terrifying whispers her mother would murmur through the attic door at night. She spoke of the rituals, the punishments, and the way Alvera convinced her that monsters were always watching. The defense attempted to argue that Alvera suffered from severe mental illness and was not fully aware of her actions. Psychiatrists testified that she had long struggled with paranoia and delusions, believing she was protecting her children from an unseen evil. But the prosecution countered that Alvera had been fully aware of her actions. She had cleaned the crime scene, hidden the evidence, and continued her daily life as if nothing had happened. This was not the behavior of a woman disconnected from reality. This was cold, calculated cruelty. When the verdict was finally delivered, guilty on all charges, there was no outburst, no reaction from Alvera. She sat motionless, her hands resting in her lap. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even then, she did not flinch. But as the guards led her away, witnesses swore they heard her whisper something under her breath, a quiet, eerie phrase that sent chills through those close enough to hear. They still watch. With the trial over, the town tried to move forward, but the scars of the case remained. The Holloway house was declared a crime scene and left abandoned. No one dared buy it, and over the years it fell into decay. The once pristine Victorian home became a rotting shell, its windows shattered, its doors warped from neglect. Weeds overtook the yard, and the well, once a source of horror, was sealed with cement. People who passed by the house at night reported strange occurrences. Some claimed to hear faint whispers, others saw fleeting shadows moving behind the broken windows. A few brave teenagers who dared to enter the house swore they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something unseen was still lurking within its walls. Liora, now free from the horrors of her childhood, was placed in the care of specialists who helped her recover. She was given a new identity, a chance to start over. But despite the safety of her new life, she remained haunted. She never spoke publicly about her past, never shared what she had endured in detail. Years later, a journalist who had followed the case managed to track her down. When he asked her if she ever thought about the house where she had suffered, she only said one thing before walking away.